Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Welcome back to part B of our lecture regarding the culture of conformity that was the 1950s. Now, we left off with talking a lot about white flight, suburbanization, and the culture of conformity. We want to shift here because, as I said, the very last thing was that anything that fell outside this culture of conformity was immediately viewed as suspect at best, branded as communism at worst. And what this does is create a culture of fear that permeated every level of US society, even comic books. This would include, of course, the most famous event of the era, and that's the Second Red Scare. You see, what happened was in the 1950s, this culture of conformity led to the Second Red Scare. We normally refer to it as McCarthyism. Now, technically speaking, McCarthyism was a smaller subset era of the larger Second Red Scare. But for purposes of this course, let's just go with McCarthyism being part of the culture of fear, part of the Second Red Scare. And so what happens is the Second Red Scare will last from about 1950 to 1954, although the anti-communist paranoia will both precede it and last long after that. And what happens is a little-known junior senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, will exploit the anti-communist anxieties and lead a witch hunt of communists in the federal government. So in 1950, he gives a speech in Wheeling, West Virginia. And during this speech, this women's group, he gives a compelling, seemingly, argument for why he felt the United States was losing the Cold War under Harry Truman. And during this speech, he then said that the Truman administration and the State Department were infested with, quote, hundreds of communists, and that he had a list of names. He had the names. Now, over the next couple of years, he will not undercover a single communist agent. But because of the Cold War fears, this culture of fear that existed, it was easy for McCarthy to exploit the issue. And he mobilized his true believers, his base, based on this fear. And you have to realize, initially this was targeted at government employees. But it didn't just affect or impact government employees. The FBI ran with this idea all across the country, keeping tabs on people who might be associated with communists. Investigations would extend to groups that challenged that conformity culture, such as labor rights activists, civil rights activists, homosexuals, and immigrants, Latinos. Regular people, even if there was an accusation that they might somehow just maybe could be aligned with communism, could have their careers and lives ruined. So, for instance, if you were a teacher and you were suspected of having communist sympathies, all it took was one accusation and your career was over. Because once you're labeled a communist, it's difficult to find work. You become socially isolated and will have a very difficult time rebuilding your reputation. Now, was it true that Soviets had spies? Yep. Even in the federal government, there were spies. But so many innocent people got caught in the crosshairs of McCarthyism. It's impossible to know how many, but so many lives and careers are ruined and destroyed by the witch hunt. There was a massive curtailing of civil liberties, a massive quelling of political dissent. And it didn't just stop with suspected communists. And when we talk about the Second Red Scare that targeted communists, but there was another part to what the historians call the Lavender Scare, or the systematic purging of gays and lesbians from the federal government. You realize to many people in 1950, homosexuals were almost more of a threat to national security than communists were. There was this belief that homosexuality was a mental disorder, dating back to 1917 immigration. We talked about that. And that the idea was that this was a mental disorder, that gays would not be able to resist the pervasive arguments made by communists to turn them or to have them spy on America. And because of this so-called mental disability, they would be more likely to become subversive sleeper agents. In other words, because they weren't mentally strong enough to be non-gay, non-queer, they would not be able to resist communist persuasion. Also, because homosexual activity was illegal at that time in every state, there was a fear that Soviet government officials could blackmail a homosexual person into giving state secrets for fear that the Soviet government would expose them as a homosexual. If this all sounds incredulous and ridiculous, it's because it is. There was never a case of anything like this happening. But the fear of it stood out. And by the 1950s, the state and federal governments began to purge suspected homosexuals from government work. And this policy would last over 25 years, unlike the Second Red Scare, which would lasted 5 years, leaving thousands of Americans without work. Because losing a job in the federal government just didn't look good on your resume. And people in Congress would exploit this issue, even though Joe McCarthy never did himself. There were some rumors that the longtime bachelor maybe, possibly, might be. So he didn't want to draw attention to the issue. But others in Congress did exploit the issue. In many ways, the Lavender Scare went deeper and lasted much longer than the Red Scare did. So while the Red Scare will end by the mid-50s, the purging of gays and lesbians from federal agencies lasted well into the 1970s. The newspaper stopped reporting it, but it becomes basically permanent government policy. And so we can see all areas of our lives were being impacted. All areas of government life and laws and policies were being examined. And one of the impacts of the Cold War and Red Scare, not just the Lavender Scare, but was to also review our immigration policy for fear of outsiders coming in. And this was done on two fronts. You see, on the one hand, some realized that the racial quota system was bad Cold War foreign policy, but also that the Immigration Act should be rewritten to prevent communists from entering the country. So on the one hand, using a racialized quota system was bad, but having a quota system that kept out protective communists was good. And so they would introduce a new Immigration Act known as the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. And this maintained the quota system, but it also would introduce a new system of preferences that were based on skill set and family reunification. And so this sounded a lot less racial, therefore a lot more palatable in the Cold War environment. And basically what it does is it standardizes previous acts by installing a low numerical ceiling compared to the rise of the nation's population. It also put quotas on former British colonies in the Caribbean to limit migration of blacks. Though it did officially take away the racial bar to citizenship, so it wasn't just that we didn't, so black people could now immigrate and naturalize if we would let them in. So less racial, but still racial. And it did also technically allow Japanese and Koreans to become naturalized if we allow them in. Truman would veto it, but Congress passed it over his veto, kind of like they did with Wilson's 1917 Immigration Act. And basically, the McCarran-Walter Act will allow national quotas at a rate of 1/6 of 1% of each nation's population back to 1920 census. Yeah. We're going back to 1920 US Census, not even 1950, because we want to make sure it's more focused on Western Europeaners. And the result of this was that 85% of the 154,000 annual visas available were allotted to individuals of Northern and Western Europe heritage. The act continued the practice of not including the Western Hemisphere in the quota system, but fear of immigration from Mexico, though still not in the quota system, would be dealt with in other ways. Yeah, remember that Bracero program, that temporary wartime provision that would last until 1964? While an estimated 4.6 million Mexicans entered the country legally through the Bracero program between 1942 and 1964. States like California soon became dependent on Bracero workers. At the same time, though, hundreds of thousands of Mexican workers crossed the border without permission to find jobs on the farms of employers willing to flout the law. This especially included Texas. Remember, Texas was originally excluded in the Bracero program from 1942 through 1947. And that's where we're introduced to a new term called wetbacks. This racial epithet was used to describe Mexicans who illegally entered Texas by crossing the Rio Grande. Now, ultimately, the federal government would turn a blind eye to the Texas employment of these undocumented immigrants, even after hiring undocumented immigrants became illegal because, again, Texas needed laborers, they cried foul, and they didn't want to give in to the Bracero program. And so Texas begins importing thousands and tens of thousands of Mexican migrant workers in violation of the law because they didn't want to submit to those supposedly rigid demands of the Bracero program, which we all know were ignored anyway. But by 1953, the government decided enough was enough. By refusing to participate in the Bracero program, South Texas farmers had essentially received their labor for less money than farmers who complied. And Border Patrol head Harlan B. Carter, pictured on your screen, who was a convicted murderer who killed a Latino teenager back in 1931 and who later headed the National Rifle Association, the NRA, was frustrated by the sheer number of Mexican immigrants, both legal and undocumented, within the United States. And he would convince President Eisenhower to ramp up immigration enforcement efforts. In 1953, Carter tried to get the National Guard involved as a forerunner of Operation Wetback. Yes, that was the actual name. But since the U.S. military is not supposed to be used in domestic laws, he couldn't gain authorization to do so. So instead, in 1954, the government would introduce officially Operation Wetback, which would use the Border Patrol as a resource instead. Now, the Border Patrol didn't have a lot of troops, but it used military tactics and propaganda to achieve its goals. It was headed in part by General Joseph Swing, who was head of Immigration and Naturalization Services, INS, and was planned like a warlike strike. In an interview with the Los Angeles Times, Harlan Carter promised to sweep factories, farms, and other workplaces that would end with the detention of undocumented Mexican workers and place them in holding facilities to await deportation. It would be, in his words, quote, the biggest drive against illegal aliens in history, unquote. News of raids terrified the Latino community of the United States, many of whom remembered the waves of forced deportations from the 1930s. Historians have documented that behind the scenes wheeling and dealing that the U.S. participated in during Operation Wetback, deals not publicized to the public at that time, immigration officials in South Texas, immigration officials would threaten South Texas employers, some of whom resorted to hiring their own private armed guards to fend off Border Patrol officers. With the stepped up raids offering watered down versions of the Bracero program to let them get papers for their workers without committing to all the program's strenuous requirements. So South Texas said, wait. You're going to raid our farms and deport our workers. No. How about this? We're going to hire armed guards to prevent that from happening. And instead, here's what you should do. Negotiate with us, and we will enter into a pseudo bracero program. Doesn't have all those legal requirements. We'll pay them less. We'll get some phony paperwork, and you can just leave us alone, okay? And the government agrees to it. Historian Kelly Lytle Hernandez described it as such, saying, quote, Operation Wetback was lawless. It was arbitrary. It was based on a lot of xenophobia. And it resulted in a sizable, large-scale violation of people's rights, including the forced deportation of, once again, U.S. citizens. So in the summer of 1954, the government began deporting braceros from the United States who were accused of creating a labor shortage for native-born Americans following the war. The operation would use these military-style tactics to remove Mexican immigrants, some also U.S. citizens, from the United States. Though millions of Mexicans had legally entered the country through the Joint Immigration Program, Operation Wetback was designed to send them back to Mexico. With the help of the Mexican government, which sought the return of Mexican nationals to alleviate their own labor shortage, Border Patrol agents and local officials would use these military techniques and engage in a coordinated tactical operation to remove these immigrants. Inside the United States, the anti-Mexican sentiment was pervasive, with harsh portrayal of Mexican immigrants as being dirty, disease-bearing, and irresponsible. This was just normal. They would use widespread racial stereotypes to justify the sometimes brutal treatment of immigrants as they were being deported. During Operation Wetback, tens of thousands of immigrants were shoved into buses, boats, planes, and sent to often unfamiliar parts of Mexico where they struggled to rebuild their lives. In Chicago alone, 3 planes a week were filled with immigrants and flown into Mexico. In Texas, 25% of all the immigrants deported were crammed onto boats that were later compared to slave ships. Some would die of sunstroke, diseases, or other causes while in custody. Some U.S. statistics estimate up to 800,000 people. Other estimates suggest 1.3 million people would be deported under this policy known as Operation Wetback. Now, to be clear, those are the official government numbers. Mexican American scholars put the number closer to 300,000, which is still bad, but the reason is the U.S. government wants to exaggerate the number because they're trying to promote that they're saving jobs for quote-unquote true Americans. And though this took place more than 60 years ago, Operation Wetback charged back into the news when then candidate for President Donald Trump endorsed the program during his presidential campaign in 2016. Though he did not refer to the program by name, Trump praised the policy that dumped undocumented immigrants into the Mexican territory, saying that, quote, they never came back, unquote. This was not true. This anti-communist, anti-immigrant, anti-homosexual, stick with the white middle class suburban America became the focus of this culture conformity. And anyone outside that normal was suspect and rejected. However, this carefully crafted culture of conformity began to show cracks. There were cracks in the consensus even in the early 1950s. And these cracks began to form and sever and fissure by the late 50s, early 1960s as civil rights movements begin in large force. But more on that next time. So until then, take care and bye-bye.